Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, it was not the best of weeks for the EU, as their trip to China to talk trade saw van der Leyen and her entourage met with about as much diplomatic disrespect and humiliation as one could possibly get.
Yeah, absolutely. And basically, China just sent the EU packing, and we'll explain why. We thought previously, and I certainly did in my own podcast, that there was an understanding that this summit should have been a major turning point for the European Union in their realization how massively dependent they are on China and will need to be in the future. And clearly, relations were already souring because of ongoing comments by the Europeans, particularly the so-called Atlanticists, who keep making reference to things like Xinjiang and Tibet, make reference to Taiwan, make reference to China's so-called unfair trade practices, which aren't unfair, just basically, to put it very crudely, China's cost of living is significantly less than the West, so they can manufacture widgets far cheaper. Therefore, the West is incapable of being able to compete with them on a level playing field through our own reckless economic financial policies for decades and how we totally abused fiat currencies, etc., etc. And originally, there was supposed to be this summit for 2 days, and even 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was claims that I heard that the Chinese were going to cut it to a day. And there was even claims that perhaps the meeting wouldn't even take place at all. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The European contingent rolls into town and gets rather unceremoniously off a bus. There's no, with all due respect, high-ranking Chinese officials to meet them. It is basically a diplomatic fiasco. I mean, it's from a Chinese perspective about as insulting as it can get. So that set the mood, certainly from a Chinese perspective. And then, of course, to make things 100 times worse, what do the Western leaders, Brussels, do? They immediately start, as they always do, trying to give China a lecture. Now, anyone who understands the Chinese knows that is the last thing you should ever do. No matter whether you're 100% right or, in their case, 100% wrong, you just don't do it. If you want to reach a consensus with the Chinese and persuade them to change their minds, you have to do so by being reasonable, but being firm in a polite way, making your points. And if they're in agreement, because actually they're correct, then they're going to be far more likely then to change their mind with regards to trade in the future, how they can address these problems that the West suffers because big business wants to function and operate in China and continue to do so. The automotive sector is one example of this. But if you come in and start criticizing China and basically saying this is an inflection point in our relationship, and you need to basically do what we tell you to do. No wonder the Chinese are going to go terribly sorry, but there's nothing to discuss here. And I think that effectively is the end of that. And until nations actually, and let's face it, all 27 leaders from the EU countries should have turned up and made individual representation and start to not allow these Atlanticists in Brussels to get in the way of what Europe needs is desperately a trade deal. And also, bear in mind, a few years ago, they had this huge investment deal that was supposed to be signed. The Americans persuaded them, the Europeans, not to do so, which was idiotic. That got sort of put on ice permanently. And there was talk a couple of months ago of resurrecting that, which would have been huge investment inside Europe by the Chinese, which would have been extremely beneficial to Europe. And of course, all that's gone out the window. And Europe is just stood there, not learning any lessons. For example, to make statements today about the fact that, and we'll talk about the EU and the US shortly and the whole fiasco that is, that buying US energy is cheaper than Russian energy, which anybody who understands anything about energy knows it's just not true. And Europe needs cheap Russian energy. It needs massive Chinese investment too, because Europe is falling apart rapidly. And it's that arrogance and that ignorance and the failure to understand the gravity of the problems that Europe is facing. And to sit there and have the temerity to walk into China's backyard trying to shout the odds and tell China, like as though this is 40, 50 years ago, you're going to do as you're told, like there's some sort of subservient colonial power is beyond absurd, and it just puts Europe in a weaker and weaker position. And as much as there's all this ideological baggage with Russia, which there is, we know it, it's another thing with China. China was something that could have been fixed reasonably easily. But of course, now, who knows whether that's retrievable or not. And, rather like it's very obvious China is decoupling from the United States. At some point, China will also start to say, well, really, is there any point in us trying to work with the Europeans anymore? The only saving grace could be the big business is already extremely unhappy across Europe and particularly Germany with regards to a potential trade deal and investment between the EU and China. They're equally not very happy about this no deal that was announced between the US and the EU, and we'll come on to that shortly in more detail. But the whole thing is just an example of an emperor with no clothes who sits there arrogantly thinking that they still rule the roost and the world is subservient to them, and having no understanding whatsoever that the world's moved on and has absolutely no interest in being bullied by a continent that is failing economically, financially, societally, in terms of its health care, in terms of education, in terms of everything. It's just completely melting down precisely because of all this arrogance, ignorance, and stupidity. And it just is refusing to understand the consequences for its idiotic behavior.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that obviously the uh, van der Leyen coming with her entourage to Beijing back in May. There was the expectations that they were going to set the groundwork for a number of different meetings leading up to an eventual trade agreement or at least a restructure. And the irony, of course, is that Europe has this mentality, and you expressed it quite well, of this arrogance of being greater than they actually are on the world stage. During the old Cold War days, they were the redheaded stepchild stuck between Washington and Moscow, and they really didn't have a big say in what was going on. They were just the buffer zone between the two superpowers. Now all of a sudden, 2000 hits, and we have enter now a third one in China, the rise of China, and Europe really has not progressed. It has not grown, it has not innovated, and so they're still trying to push the same things that they did in the past, whether it's what Macron's trying to do in Africa, trying to hold on there. Britain making rattling sabers of Taiwan or war with Russia. But Europe has got this mentality that they think they're actually on par with the United States, Russia, or China, and they're not. And so, what you mentioned about the disrespect that Europe had, that van der Leyen had by lecturing them on their own soil, The inevitability is that Europe, to survive, needs to choose a side, and to choose a side with, for all intents and purposes, hat in hand. Either choose the United States, where you're going to be a number one vassal, and your economy is simply there to provide investment and growth for, America first, or what you had with Russia, who, following the rise, the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of Russia, Russia wanted to be in part of Europe. They wanted to be partners. They wanted to be brothers. But instead, of course, under the pressure from the United States and their own lack of foresight, they pushed Russia to the side. And now, of course, them working as partners is pretty much out of the question. So that leaves China. And China, of course, is just interested in respect, equal partnership. Let's do trade. If you've got things we want, we absolutely want to trade with you. If you have, or we have all these things, they just happen to be better than what you produce, and we want to sell them to uh, your population much cheaper. But that's not good enough because of the old mentality, and this is why we've talked about. There's a number of different cycles ending, and the 500-year colonial cycle is definitely coming to a screeching halt as the multipolar world emerges. And we're seeing this on a micro scale in the meetings, such as what happened over the weekend with Europe and China.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, it's worth on the subject of Europe, where the United States keeps announcing trade deals, though they aren't trade deals at all. I mean, we had the fiasco with the Japanese talking about we got a trade deal in place and all this Japanese investment, $550 billion, and then the Japanese came out and said there is no trade deal, nothing's been agreed, nothing's been signed off. And then today the Japanese came out and went, it's not 550 billion, even if we sign anything, it might be 1 to 2% of that. So $5 to $11 billion. So, in keeping with that, there's this big statement where, as usual, Trump comes out talking about a trade deal with the Europeans, where again, there is no trade deal because nothing has been signed, nothing's been agreed, and in fact, all 27 member states of the European Union have to agree to this deal for it to be signed off. If one of them doesn't, the deal's dead in the water. So Trump talks about this 15% levy on most imports from the EU, including automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors. And we'll talk about those in a bit of detail in a minute. And then these, just wildly speculative, random number generator figures of they're going to purchase $750 billion worth of energy from the US and invest 600 billion more in the US. What time frame? 100 years, a million years, 2 years, no one knows. And where did those figures come from? They just made them up because nothing's been agreed. It's not even a framework for an agreement. The flip side is all European countries will have to put no tariffs on US products. And frankly, there seems to be this very weird, myopic view of what tariffs are. If I had a country, I'd have no tariffs because tariffs are a tax on the people and producers, and they're going to create massive price inflation and make goods that are already maybe expensive, even more expensive, 15% more expensive if it's based on 15%. And then, of course, Trump goes, the Europeans are going to, buy vast amounts of military equipment. Everyone the US has these fake trade deals with are going to buy vast amounts of military equipment. The military equipment the US can't make anymore because China's not allowing them to have magnets and rare earths to manufacture that military hardware, as we discussed previously. And this is just so ridiculous that the EU looks like not even a paper tiger. The United States is just making stuff up as they go along with no reality whatsoever. That anyone in the world with half a brain cell knows this. They both look absolutely idiotic and stupid. And frankly, what's von der Leyen doing with Trump in Scotland, of all places? Ironically, Britain left the European Union via Brexit. So it's not even an EU member state. So they're there for some reason. And they just sat there, presumably, and came up with some wild figures and went, oh, we'll just tell everyone that because it looks good. And already, of course, when you look at automobile sector, the German companies are going, hang on, this is going to be a real problem for us. And of course, also big farmers looking at this going, we have a huge problem because if you look at pharmaceuticals, that's the number one product that's the US imported from the EU last year, $155 billion worth. At one point, Trump was talking about a 200% tariffs on those pharmaceuticals, which, of course, who cares because Trump says so many things and then they never come to pass. So that, is immediately starting to raise questions in those sectors. So I imagine there'll be a huge pushback from business sectors across the European Union, associations to do with semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, and obviously the automobile sector. There's already some countries voicing concerns going, well, basically the EU capitulated. Well, on the basis of that being true, which at this point there's no evidence whatsoever it's true, then yes, it looks like the European Union's completely capitulated. But why are these countries saying what deal? Who gave von der Leyen the authority to go and make to have these discussions with Trump and come up with some ideas where, we all know at the end of the day the European Union is not a democracy, but this just makes it look like a laughingstock. And what both the United States and Europe don't realize is the global south looking at this going, well, this is another example of a failed empire or a failing empire. This is the West just capitulating. They have made up fake trade deals. Well, they're calling them deals, but there's no deal in at the moment. Maybe there will be in the future, but when? 3 months, 6 months? And where's exactly all this money coming from for the EU to invest? The EU's bankrupt. It hasn't got any money. It was talking about basically trying to steal Russia's frozen assets to pay for the Ukraine war. It's got nothing to invest. So it just proves categorically this is just made up nonsense. And you have to start questioning, because there's already question marks about apparently a trade deal signed with the Vietnamese and the US. We know the Japan one's meaningless. The UK one's was basically reverting to what the situation was before there was any trade disagreements or threats of Liberation Day tariff proposals put in place. There's no deal with anyone. And the rest of the world's looking at this going, why would we want to make a deal with the United States when none of these are deals anyway? And this is all because in the US's mind, they think, well, if it looks like we've forced the European Union to cave in, all these global South countries will panic and go, well, if the EU, because it's so strong and powerful and it's one of the most dynamic economies in the world, if they cave in, we'll have to cave in as well. And they're not. They're looking at it going, the European Union's a joke. It's collapsing. These figures don't mean anything because, again, they might be able to fool far too many people in the West, but the rest of the world just looks at this and goes, what are you playing at? I mean, are you ever going to actually have a proper trade deal? And then, of course, we had the claim that the US said, we've got a trade deal in place with the Chinese. Well, why is there a US and Chinese trade delegation meeting in Stockholm today to discuss a trade deal between the two countries? Is because there is no trade deal. Nothing's been agreed in any way, shape, or form. And and then we have collectively the media is just not saying anything. And really, someone needs to turn around to Trump and go, but you're not signing any deals. You can sit there and go, this is the biggest deal ever made. Rather like all these deals apparently the US made with the Saudis. At the end of the day, where's the money? Where's the investment? It's like we're going to have Stargate, this $500 billion project to be the greatest AI country in the world. And now there's talk that that's never going to get off the ground because they can't get the investment in place. Rather like no one wanted to invest in Ukraine. And that looks like it's having the plug pulled on it. It's all just superficial nonsense. And frankly, it's a joke and an embarrassment. And really, people in Western countries need to just say, enough is enough. We're not putting up with this. Stop trying to treat us like we're morons when we know precisely you're doing absolutely nothing. And all these figures are meaningless because, as Japan points out, we haven't even signed a deal, but if we do, the figure's maybe 1% of that. So is it 1% in terms of the investment by the Europeans? And who of these Europeans agreed to anything anyway? And in purchasing all this US energy, they already can't purchase anymore because the US doesn't produce any energy. So what are they going to do? Buy a load of arms they'll get in 20 years where maybe the US can build them again. They'll pay money for energy they're not going to get for the next decade and invest what money in the US? Investing in what? No one knows. Rather like no one knows any of these locations for investment to do with West Asia, Japan, or anywhere else. And that's the state of play where we're at. And really, we need to start accepting that we are looking absurd on the world stage. And that is extremely bad news for us when we need to be in a position to try and build relations and show we in the West are changing and that we can sit at the table as equal partners, as we'll have to, with global South countries.
So I think in the end, it's an interesting point where everything that is being done and said, all the rhetoric is for political expediency to try to prop up numbers of failing administrations. Obviously, van der Leyen had just recently went through a vote of no confidence as she survived. So she leads the way in a trade delegation to Beijing. She scoots over to Scotland to have to negotiate with, the negotiator, Donald Trump, and she gets handed it to her in both instances. Well, the reality is in Europe, Europe is run by France, Britain, and the UK. Everybody else, well, it's not run by the EU. Yet the EU is trying its best to act like we are the voice and the direction for all of Europe. But I think something you pointed on, and this is going to be my final point on this, is that I think the end result is going to be that many of the nations within Europe, maybe not necessarily Germany, France, Britain at first, but you're seeing Hungary, you're seeing Slovenia, you're seeing a number of different, even Poland is starting to rebel against this. I think this is going to be soon enough where it's going to drive a wedge and see the capitulation and the destruction of the EU system. And at that point, you're going to start seeing every country out for its own, out for itself. They're going to be more than happy to come to Beijing and say, hey, you know what? We really need some help. Can you get some investment into our economy? Can you bring us some goods that we don't, that we absolutely vitally need? And then you even go to Russia and say, is there some way you can get build a new pipeline or do something to get us the energy, the cheaper energy to help us recover? Because I think more than anything, the United States is this paper tiger. They're playing, Donald Trump is playing the role of P.T. Barnum, where look at this, the tallest man in history. And then all of a sudden, after he leaves the stage, you find out that the individual is just simply wearing stilts. And I think that's really what everything is going on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one final point to which bears out what you're saying, Ken, is the Serbians came out and said they're at a meeting to do with the 80th anniversary, obviously, of the end of World War II, Victory Day celebrations in Russia. That Xi said to Vucic, who's obviously the president in Serbia, "What you need, whatever you need, we'll give you." And he basically said, "Well, I'd like you to build some factories." He was a bit taken aback and said, "Well, maybe you could build some factories." Meaning, if you're there to be, we can bankroll massive investment to really stimulate economic growth. But of course, Serbia is not part of the EU. But this is the point with this, that you have to start to think, as you've just pointed out, Ken, when are European countries going to start going, enough is enough? When are they going to start to go, we need to look after our own interests? Because if they look at countries like, obviously, Serbia, and say, well, look how they're benefiting from investment from China, and they haven't got this Brussels Atlanticist crowd stopping this happening. But the European Union, if it cannot survive in its current form, if things carry on the way they are, what happens to it, it remains to be seen. But what this has highlighted, this whole podcast, is just the fiasco of what's going on in the West, and it's clearly indicative of an empire that is rapidly falling apart.
Absolutely. Paul, as always, thank you very much for your insight and your analysis.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.